Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I think I'm going to begin because I know that people will come in as time goes on. Uh, Welcome to November's webinar for Drupal for Gov. Our topic for today is Recipe Unpack, leaving Drupal CMS is what you're supposed to do. Our speaker is Josh Mitchell. Before I hand over the reins to Josh, I'd like to just share some things about Drupal for Gov. Most of you here know we are a community of open source advocates and we love everything Drupal and open source. So, in addition to this webinar that we hold every third Thursday at 3 p.m., we also have our Drupal GovCon conference, which was held this past August. When we can, we hold global training days and have training days, and we also help organize the Gov Summit at DrupalCon North America. If you have the space and you're interested in doing a global training day or have any questions, please reach out to us at our email, drupalforgov@gmail. We also are available on Slack and LinkedIn. I like to share other events that are happening within the community. February, Florida Drupal Cap is happening in Orlando, Florida. And in March, Drupal Camp New Jersey in Princeton, New Jersey is happening. So if you're in those areas, please check that out. And also, as I mentioned before, we're always looking for spaces to hold trainings and half days. So if you have the space or you're interested in sponsoring a day of learning, please reach out to us at info@drupalforgov.us. Every webinar that we post, we always upload to YouTube, and I'm actively streaming to YouTube now. So if you missed any past webinar or want to check this one out after it's over, please do so. And last but definitely not least, our speaker for today is Josh Mitchell. He currently leads teams and including a time as CTO of the Drupal Association. Josh now consults with organizations to help them achieve best practices in digital strategy, technology, architecture, agile processes, and product development. Thank you, Josh, for being our November speaker. I am going to stop sharing my screen and hand over the reins to you.
All right. Well, if you're here for Recipe Unpack. Leaving Drupal CMS is what you're supposed to do. And just a forenote, if you happen to see this presentation at let's see, Bad Camp this past September, it is a very similar presentation, so you might want to skip it. All right. Well, we had the nice little introduction, so I won't go into all the things that were included in that. But I did want to call out the photo right here. This was actually a photo that was a GIF that I uploaded to the Drupal Association's Slack channel, so that every time they mentioned me after I left, it would pop up this picture of me making a sandwich, and it just seems so appropriate to Drupal recipes unpack. So what are Drupal recipes? Recipes were introduced in Drupal 10.3, and they provide a standardized way to install and configure Drupal sites. So if you kind of don't want to have to start from scratch, that's essentially where recipes are giving you a starting point, if you will. You can include in a recipe, you can include module dependencies and theme dependencies. You can execute configuration. You can generate default content. There's a lot of things you can do with them. They're composable, so you can combine multiple recipes into a larger recipe or what is sometimes called a site template. And we actually have this in Drupal core in the example of the standard recipe or the umami demo recipe. Those are all converted over to recipes now at this point, and it kind of gives a way for you to start with something other than a site that doesn't have any content types. So as of Drupal 11.2, there's a new feature that has been added as a dependency in Composer to all new Drupal projects, and this is a recipe unpack feature. And it allows basically for if you require a recipe, it will automatically unpack it into your project. And I'm actually going to do a demonstration of this in just a few minutes. So, as first steps, you've got to get recipes in place, or the recipe unpack capability in place. So, if you're not already on Drupal 11.2 or greater, you're going to want to basically do an update to get to that latest version. If you are requiring, Composer Drupal, or I'm sorry, if you're requiring Drupal 11.2 or higher at any point, it's already going to have this in there, so you wouldn't need to do those steps. But the Composer required Drupal core recipe pack is Unpack is the new plugin that's there. When you do that requirement, it will automatically ask you if you want to allow it. You can technically also configure that individually. And that gives you this new command, Composer, Drupal, recipe, unpacked. Um, let's talk about how that kind of works. So it automatically is going to unpack a recipe, and you'll see what that looks like in a second. So I don't want to go too much into that, but you can actually set it so that it will not automatically unpack a recipe, so that you actually have to run the command against each individual recipe in order to get it to happen, rather than doing it on require. And one quick consideration here is if you are using Recipe Unpack, it doesn't work against dev requirements. So anything you've got that's under required dev, like say the Devil module or maybe some linting or capabilities that are related to local development, that's not going to actually unpack automatically, even if it's included in a recipe. I've also found that if you're doing something fairly complex, like if you're trying to do lots of recipes at once, recipe unpack may not be the way to go. I recommend trying to keep it as small as possible to make it really, really viable. Well, it wouldn't be a great presentation without a live demonstration, so I've kind of set up some things for us to talk through here. First of all, if you're not familiar with it, Drupal CMS is kind of the starting point for a lot of Drupal right now. It's not core Drupal. It is a project that exists that is a very opinionated way to start a Drupal project. And if I'm looking at Drupal CMS, and I look at its composer.json, what you're going to see is a lot of requirements to recipes, basically. So when you see here this Drupal CMS accessibility tools, Drupal CMS AI, all of these are dependencies that are kind of added to the Drupal CMS project, that give a lot of functionality in a very opinionated way. So all of these recipes are actually stored in a recipes folder. And you can see a recipe like Drupal CMS admin UI. And if I look at the recipe, you can actually see all the dependencies. So you can see right here that if I were to install Drupal CMS admin UI, it's going to give me the coffee module and the dashboard module and contextual and Gen toolbar, navigation, the simple add another module, Tagify users list. It's got some configuration that it actually wants to import. And it actually wants to do some actions in there to basically apply all those changes. So that's fundamentally what it looks like whenever you're looking at a project like Drupal CMS. But let's say I've got an existing project, and I want to add the Drupal CMS admin UI. This is a really good example of something that applies pretty cleanly, and it works really well for an existing project. So this is just a stock Drupal 10 site right here. You can see d10 ddev.sut, so it's running in my local ddev. It's got the admin toolbar. If I were to go into the content area, it's going to be using Claro. All pretty straightforward, right? Just looks like Drupal 10. Well, let me bounce over here to my, actually, let me do this with Drupal 11. Same thing. I'll start with Drupal 11 though, just because it looks nearly identical. Again, Claro, I'm looking in the main site here, but it applies a little bit more cleanly to Drupal 11, so I'll do the demonstration here first. So the first thing I'm going to want to do, this is already a Drupal 11.2 website. I'm just going to do the simplest demonstration possible, which is just let's add the composer recipe unpack to our site. Real quick, can people hear me talking? Because I'm frozen on my screen.
Yes, we can hear.
Okay, good. It just unfroze right as I said that. So the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to do a composer require Drupal. Let's see, Drupal CMS admin UI. And if you were watching the screen closely, you'll notice that the requirement went from showing Drupal CMS admin UI to unpacking and putting all those dependencies directly into my composer.json. So that what this allows me to do is basically leave Drupal CMS and move to, or in this case, the Drupal CMS admin UI. It allows me to unpack that recipe so I don't actually have to um, have that one dependency to the Drupal CMS admin UI. I actually get all the individual modules, which means I can just kind of maintain these modules separately as I go along. So now that I've unpacked it in here, I should be able to run a drush recipe. So if you're in your web directory, so in this case, I'm inside web, I can run drush recipe dot recipes. So that's this folder right up here. And you can see I have Drupal CMS admin UI. And if I run that, it's going to tell me I mistyped something. Oh, it's because I only did dot. I meant to do dot dot. Apologies on that. That's what you get for doing live demos. All right, applying recipe. It just installed all the things and it says admin UI applied successfully. Now I can go directly over to my Drupal 11 site. I hit refresh and looky there. I have the Drupal CMS admin UI and it looks just like I expect it to. All right, let's bounce back over here. If I were to do this against the entire Drupal CMS project, it gets a little bit more difficult because I would actually want to go through um, and I can run recipe unpack against the entire project here. And what we're going to see is all of these individual dependencies are going to open up for me. But I first have to type composer correctly. Bear with me. I have a new keyboard. I'm getting used to it. There we go. So what this is demonstrating is if I'm starting a new Drupal CMS project, I can actually say, you know what? This was my starting point. I like that starting point. I want to move on to maintaining everything independently. And by unpacking it, it gives me that option. Now, if I want to apply this to a Drupal 10 site, keep in mind that the core package is not there. I don't have that Drupal recipe unpack. So I'm first going to want to do a composer require Drupal. Bear with me, I've forgotten the exact syntax. And boom. You'll notice here it's asking me if I want to allow it. I'm going to type Y and hit return, and that adds it to my allowed plugins. And now, even though I'm on Drupal 10 point, I think 5 on this site, um, it is giving me the ability to run those recipe unpack commands against a 10.5 site. So it's automatically included in Drupal 11.2 and above, but it is totally compatible with any site that's running Drupal 10.3 or higher, which you should be on at least 10.4 right now because 10.3 is not a supported branch. All right. So wrapping all that up, it's a streamlined workflow that allows for dependency management via recipe unpacking. All you have to do is composer require a recipe, and if recipe unpack is present, it will just automatically run and unpack all those dependencies into your composer.json. You can then run the recipe to install the new dependencies. I will say one caveat there. When you go to run the recipe, I have found that sometimes you need to do a drush cache rebuild first. So you might find yourself needing to do that. But literally, once you've run that recipe, you should have a working version of it locally that you can now click around and test on. Obviously, you don't want to run this in production. It's something that you use for local development when you're trying to build out a new feature and you want to get all that recipe goodness. And that covers recipe unpack, but we left lots of time for kind of questions and follow-ups from what you've seen today.
Feel free to unmute yourself if you have questions. Um, so you use this in conjunction with your composer installing of modules. It just allows you to package functionality together to make it easily deployable to your upper environments is
Exactly. It basically it allows you to say, I don't want to have to go in and configure all this from scratch. And somebody else has already done that and they've created a recipe,
mm,
and it will automatically do all that configuration for you. So if I'm looking at my D11 site, that recipe unpack actually went through the process of enabling the gen theme, and it gives me kind of that all the gen goodness in terms of how things look. It gives me the toolbar, the new navigation structure. If I were to go to content that had, I don't know if it creates any content with the simple add another by default, but like the simple add another module, if I add an entity reference field, it's automatically going to have that configured so that any new entity reference field would use it. It basically just makes it all look a little bit more like the Drupal CMS admin. Um, but all I had to do was apply the recipe and then run the recipe. And that that's really slick. I've used it on a couple of existing sites. I had a site that had been running Drupal 10 for the better part of a year and a half, and we had a user base that was really interested in having this new navigational layout. And we were able to just basically run the recipe. Had to clean up a couple config changes, but it probably saved a good, 8 hours of clicking around and constructing that experience. And instead, it was just applying a recipe. And I found with a lot of the Drupal CMS recipes, you can do this. There's actually entire databases or I shouldn't say database, documentation on Drupal.org with numerous recipes that are out there that kind of solve a lot of really interesting, tough problems. And you can just apply it to your site and give it a try. Again, you don't want to do this in a production way, but from a development standpoint, it really speeds the time to rolling out a new feature.
okay. So you say you wouldn't want to use it in like the production environment. So you wouldn't use it to like deploy any features to your production environment and allow it to be enabled and work. That's not best practices you advise.
Yeah, that's not best practice. What I'd want to do, and actually, that's one step I can do here with this D11 example where I've applied the admin UI. Um, After applying a recipe, I'm actually going to want to do something like a drush. Sorry, I always use shortcuts, but config export.
Mhm.
And if I config export like that, I should be able to see like any of the updates that occurred accordingly for that config.
Yeah, I saw in the demo you took it from the recipe dependency and then you converted that into the parts of the recipe. Can you talk about how that is part of the workflow for development?
Yeah, so basically, when you've done that composer command to do the require, it's going to do the automatic unpack if composer recipe unpack is available. So now you have all the dependencies here. And then running the recipe, a little step right there where it's applying and you can see 12 of 12. It's just going through all the steps in your recipe setup right here and then outputting that accordingly. And I just realized because this is a stock D11 site, I don't actually have configuration management set up, so it didn't do the export, but I can do a quick demo of what that would look like real quick. So if I'm sitting here in this D11 site and I go to extend, oop, like I said, new keyboard. Let's see, configuration manager. Why am I not seeing that in my config location? Oh, that's right. I forgot. It is because it's a stock install. Let me bounce over because I know where it's at in this site. It actually installs it to sites, default, files, sync. So basically and if I were to change my config sync directory and settings.php to something like, config, so it's on the root of the project, what we would actually see is a diff on the files that this config, whenever I did that config export, is actually outputting to here, and that's what you would then check in and deploy up the chain.
And you described using this to get a jump start on features, like basically include new features on the project. Is that kind of what it's used for mostly?
Yeah, so if I look at Drupal CMS, Drupal CMS admin UI is a really good example where you can put something in. Um, like that's pulling out all the dependencies that we see in the Drupal CMS space. I could do any of these other ones as well. If I wanted to match the Drupal CMS blog content type, I could run that one. If I wanted to apply the Drupal CMS search, I could apply that and it would unpack all that to the site. And so basically for any site, for any recipe, it's going to look like a regular project on Drupal.org. And it'll kind of give you a rundown of what it does. And I can do this for lots and lots of different examples out there. And there was just one, and since I see John Picozzi on the call, I know that Talking Drupal just covered a recipe for applying the admin, or I'm sorry, the Drupal AI ecosystem as an example. And so that's another good example of a recipe that you can run. It'll install all those dependencies and you can test it locally, keep what you want to keep, and then be able to export that out and push it up the stream.
Yeah, thanks. This is definitely an area I'm interested in. So like AI is another good example. So that's kind of the bolt-on piece there or combination of pieces.
Yeah, so if I wanted to apply that Drupal AI recipe over here on my D11, I can actually do that as well. Actually, you know what I'm going to do? Just so you can see the change of a config file, I'm going to pull up,
Mm.
oh, that's right, it's not in. So it would be under C core extensions. Okay, here we go. So right there, we can see the modules that are currently enabled. I'm going to do Drush. Let's see, not Drush. I'm going to do a composer, require, Drupal. Um, Drupal CMS AI. Okay. So if I go to my composer.json, I'm going to see a whole bunch of new AI elements in there. It hasn't installed anything yet though, because now I want to go to cd dot, let's see, cd web. So I'm doing it within the web container. And at this point, I want to run drush recipe, uh, recipes, CMS AI. I'm going to leave that empty for now, but I would be able to put in keys. That's a config action so that you can actually provide some data that will automatically get added to configuration so that it's kind of ready to go with OpenAI and Anthropic out of the box. And this one is a much more complex recipe, so you can see there's a lot more steps to the install that it's doing. But if I do a drush CDX now, I should see, boom, a whole bunch of new config changes. So again, if I had this config directory in an appropriate spot for actual production use, which would typically be like root of the folder in a config, maybe you've got some config splits, um, then this would immediately become available as a diff from a being able to package it up into a commit and create a pull request. But that basically turned on a whole bunch of new features that if I go over to my Drupal 11 site again, just like whenever I turned on Drupal admin UI, I can now go in here and I'll start seeing options for configuring AI. This has all been kind of turned on with some same defaults kind of set up so that you can see a few different things in there. So it's a really quick way to try out new ideas, new modules, and not have to go through all the tedious steps of configuring everything. You're probably going to want to customize it, make it tailored to your use case, but it gives you that ability to play in a way that I think is a lot more similar to what we used to have back in the Drupal 7 days in terms of being able to turn something on and immediately begin working on it. So good fun.
So when you're building out functionality in your local environments, do you and like are you creating, have you ever created your own recipes with like unique functionality, like with custom modules, or is it tailored specifically to be able to implement like already existing?
So I have not created a like a module specific recipe, but I have actually exported some ECA recipes. ECA is event condition actions. And it has the capability of doing some really powerful basically models. So if I look at like this duplicate content here, this ECA model is something that's, kind of visible. You can kind of look at it. But one of the key features of ECA is being able to export those things. So you can actually just set export recipe and it'll create a recipe. So this is ECA specific, but it's not like specific module specific like the Drupal AI was doing, Drupal CMS AI or the Drupal CMS admin UI. Um, Interesting. Both of those end in I. That was kind of hard to say. But I have done quite a few of these. Like I've done one that's like a notify reviewers, and it's a recipe that I've repeated on a couple different sites that needed to notify reviewers with revision log message when someone changed the workflow state from draft to in review, as an example. And the nice thing with that is like if you build it as a recipe, you can just apply it to all your new projects that you have that need. So I think a lot of developers at this point we're beginning to create a little cache of recipes that we know we want to apply to every new project that we work on because it's just something that our editors need almost every time. And so that's a good example.
Okay, good to know.
Hi, I have one question. Do you have some correct way to remove installed recipe, except manual, of course?
Yeah, so the one of the things with recipes is they're really designed for a full Drupal, like a enterprise level Drupal workflow where you have local development and then you move it up the chain. So if I'm thinking about like how I would uninstall it for one of these local sites that I've created, what I would probably do is something like this. So here's my D11 site. If I wanted it to look the same as it did before I started, then I would let's just go back to the root here. I would probably do something like git reset hard, and I just removed everything basically. And then if I do a drush site install, actually, you know what? I would first want to do a composer install to drop everything back to what I had before. If I were to go back to my composer.json now, I no longer have that um, Drupal AI or Drupal CMS admin UI. That's all gone. Um, and now I can do a brush sim. Oh, that's not going to work because it's doing all those things. So I would have to, at that point, probably do like a ddev snapshot restore. So if you created a snapshot before you started, you could always revert back and pull it out of there. Um, or in this case, since it's just a throwaway demo site where I'm just showing things off, there's no reason why I couldn't do a site install and kind of start from scratch. My D11 site, Control V. And again, I'm back to stock Drupal, nothing else on there. So the important thing with recipes is to understand there's not, you can't back it out on a site that you've applied it to unless you just manually went through and removed all those things. It is meant to be applied, not to be uninstalled. It is the application of a very opinionated set of modules and configuration for those modules. So
Would that also impact, like, so let's say if you already had a few components from a given recipe installed that maybe already had their own configuration, would that configuration ultimately be lost if you then say you wanted to adopt from the recipe?
yeah, that's a really good question. In the case where you have like components of the recipe, what will happen is it's going to fail on those portions that don't match up to um, where the config doesn't validate, where it's not able to synchronize that configuration because it already exists. So it's not going to blow away anything you have, but you may not be able to get it to apply. So uh, the more parts of the recipe are already installed and figured out, the more likely it's going to fail. So in really large complex sites, for instance, that already have some of the modules that are included in the Drupal CMS admin UI or any of those other Drupal CMS recipes, as an example, it's much more likely that you would have to like install it on a fresh site, take a look at how it's configured, and then decide what parts you can bring over and reconfigure from there. So it's definitely not it's not magic for an existing largely complex site, but sometimes it is. I mean, like this admin UI, as I've said, I've implied it on a couple projects that were they were running Claro, they were using admin toolbar. We just needed to move them to that new kind of look and feel, and it applied cleanly. So
Right. Yeah, I'm more thinking of it from the perspective of obviously everybody's had some situations where maybe they've gone down the path of installing certain modules and tried to get things up and running the way they've seen them online, and it just hasn't worked out quite correctly, or maybe it just doesn't apply to your business model totally perfectly, but this recipe does. So, it's like how do you kind of migrate to that, I guess would be the thing. But it sounds like maybe, yeah, it would be start with the recipe and then figure out how to integrate the pieces that didn't come across.
Yeah, and I will say like some recipes really lend themselves to being easily shared for an existing instance. The example I was talking about with the ECA recipe that I created that was just for notifying reviewers, because that just you could apply the recipe and then the only configuration you'd have to do is go add the reviewer field to all your content types, and it would work. So it did have an extra step that you had to apply, which is to kind of go through and repeat that edit. But the foundational part of it of, hey, does the workflow work that's going to send the email? In that case, that cleanly applied and didn't require any additional work. So um, that it really depends on how complex it is and what you're trying to apply, whether a recipe for an existing site is going to work. Any other questions?
Well,
Popping up the chat to make sure there wasn't anything there.
I don't see any, everybody's quiet, but thank you
Oh,
so much about
John did include the recipe, AI ecosystem recipe. Here we go. Yeah, if you're interested in trying a lot of kind of the AI capabilities, and I would never apply this recipe on an existing site, but it's a really good example of a recipe that lets you have all the configuration to deeply test an approach that already exists out there. So like this one allows you to, automatically test things like um, translating paragraphs automatically or automatically getting SEO feedback from an AI agent, as an example. So some good stuff there.
a lot of good information on recipes. I haven't yet to put them to use. Um, Thank you, Josh. Do we have any more questions before we end our webinar? Okay, well, thank you again, Josh.
Well, thank you. It was my pleasure.
And I hope to see everybody else next month for our December webinar. Take care and happy holidays, everybody.
Awesome. Thank